I've been invited to witness the unveiling of a device designed and built by Jackson's team based on the fold mark evidence and the ceremony witnessed in Constantinople. So what does this machine do, and how does it possibly explain where the fold marks are in the shroud?
Well, all of them were calculated as to exactly where they were. If you remember the F block?
Yep.
The F block is this block here with the 4 folds around it.
Right.
And then we had an interesting problem. We could not explain why there was a missing fold.
Right.
So the solution we came up with was a weighted bar. It does some marvelous things for us. First of all, it keeps the front of the shroud taut, so you always have a good face that doesn't fluff like a sail.
Keeps it taut, yeah.
That's right. And then it also has a tendency to pull this down right on the other side of the F block, which gives us this sharp fold here.
So it answers 2 things, is what you're saying. It answers the fact, this pole being here, why there is no fold mark at that point.
Exactly.
And why there is this F block marks here.
That's true.
Okay.
And then we also saw that very shallow fold mark that we saw before. That shallow fold mark is this free hanging fold right there.
This?
Yes, that is correct.
Right. The time has come to decide if this elaborate hypothesis could be true. The Byzantines had a great reputation for creating spectacle and theatrical liturgy. Could this be the image of Christ that was raised up every Friday that Robert de Clary saw in Constantinople? In any other field of historical research, this wealth of evidence, textile, documentary, artistic, and forensic, would be enough to conclude that the shrouds of Turin and Constantinople were one and the same. But the carbon-14 test has created a barrier. The Shroud of Turin cannot be older. Perhaps it's time to ask some questions about carbon-14. I've come to Oxford, site of one of the 3 labs which conducted the landmark tests 20 years ago. Is it possible that the margin of error of plus or minus 65 years was wrong? Should it have been wider? Professor Christopher Ramsey now runs the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit and was present here when the original test was run on the shroud.
I mean, anything is always somewhat provisional. There are always new experiments you can do. Most scientific experiments are only verified by being repeated many times, and then you reckon if you can repeat the experiment and maybe do it in a different way, you get the same answer, you're convinced. With the shroud, you're in a slightly difficult position because obviously you can't go on dating it lots and lots of times. As a scientist, I'm much more interested in getting the right answer than I am in sticking to an answer which we came to before. My own hunch at the moment from the weight of scientific data and other data would be that the shroud is medieval, but I don't necessarily think I will always hold that, and I'm certainly open to inquiries that would indicate otherwise.
There is an anomaly. The evidence from physics is seemingly at odds with that from history. But of course, even if it could be proven beyond doubt that the shrouds of Turin and Constantinople were one and the same, that still wouldn't make it authentic. After all, tradition claims that the Shroud of Turin is nothing less than the burial cloth of Christ. Even the 12th century is still 1100 years after the death of Jesus. But pressure on the reliability of the carbon-14 test has continued to build, with new forensic evidence that places the shroud yet further back in time. It is something known as the Sudarium of Oviedo in Spain. It is reputed to be the face cloth mentioned in the Gospel of John. John says that the disciples entered the tomb of Jesus on the third day after his death, only to find it empty, apart from the burial cloth and the face cloth. We also know from official records in Oviedo that the Sudarium can be accurately dated to the 5th century AD. I've invited to Turin Mark Guskin, an expert on the Sudarium of Oviedo in Spain. His evidence could push the date of the Turin shroud back another 700 years to the 5th century. This is an identical copy of the Sudarium. Its purpose was to trap blood escaping from the corpse as it was taken away for burial. Guskin believes he's identified significant evidence linking the Sudarium to the Shroud of Turin. Guskin already knew that the shroud has real blood. It belongs to the rare group AB. There are also traces of blood shed in life and blood shed in death. And finally, there are the unmistakable traces of blood from a crown of thorns on the front of the head and the back. Guskin believes all three blood features can be found on the Sudarium.
The first is the blood group, okay, which is a relatively rare blood group on the planet. It's the blood group AB, okay, and it's the same blood group of human blood on both cloths. Then there's also the differentiation between lifeblood, in other words, blood shed in life, and post-mortem blood, which can be clearly differentiated. And again, that coincides on both cloths. And that brings us to what, for me, clinches the whole matter of the cloths being used on the same body. Now, this was blood shed in life, okay, while the man in question was still alive. Now, this blood comes from wounds that were made by some kind of sharp object piercing the skin in this area of the nape of the neck. Okay, perfectly compatible with what has been called since then a crown of thorns. Okay, now if we look at this, we have exactly the same stains in the same area on the Shroud of Turin. Now the actual shape of the stains, if you do an overlay of the two, well, the actual shape, you know, the way the blood flowed coincides on both cloths.
So what you're saying is not only the blood types that are the same, the actual patterns of the blood on both cloths can be matched.
That's right. That's exactly so.
Amazing.
Which has led more than one qualified forensic doctor to say that the only conclusion you can make from that is that both cloths were used on the same body. In other words, it's too much for a simple coincidence.
But so let me understand, what you're saying is that the fact that we know exactly what happened to the Sudarium and its history has huge implications for the shroud, because obviously they both covered the same man.
That's right. And the only place that they could have coincided in time was in Jerusalem, sometime before the 4th or the 5th century. You know, there's no two ways about that. They couldn't have coincided at any given time after that.
Because we know what happened to the
exactly where the Sudarium was all the time.
These very distinctive wounds on the back of the head on the shroud link it to the Sudarium in Jerusalem before 500 AD. The Turin shroud's links with the Shroud of Constantinople pushed its date back nearly 2 centuries. Its links with the Sudarium of Oviedo push it back by another 700 years. To be sure, none of these links necessarily make it the true Shroud of Christ. It might be that it's a 5th century fake. But there is a third shroud, the one described in the Gospels, which wrapped the body of Christ in Jerusalem after his crucifixion. Could the Shroud of Turin be that shroud? That would be the most contentious connection of all, for it would make the date of the Shroud of Turin 1,300 years older than the date indicated by the carbon-14 test. And yet, that's what new findings in Colorado are hinting at. The team studying the Shroud of Turin have identified a number of links to the Shroud of Jerusalem. 1st century Jewish burial cloths, as today, had to conform to strict Jewish rules and regulations. First, they had to be linen, uncontaminated by wool. Rebecca Jackson is Jewish herself, and she's found that the cloth used for the Shroud of Turin conforms precisely.
According to Jewish law, you cannot mix linen and wool in the same fabric that will be touched. It's absolutely illegal. And that goes back way back into Egyptian culture, you know, the temple laws of ancient Egypt. And the shroud is definitely linen with some traces of cotton that could have slipped in there. But that's fine.
And that's okay?
That's okay. You can mix linen and cotton forever and ever, but you can't mix linen and wool.
Rebecca Jackson told me of another very specific link with Jewish culture.
This is 1 cubit.
Okay.
And this is 2 cubits.
Okay. So this is what would have been used as a tool of measurement, right?
Right.
So let's check it out. That's 2 cubits in width, certainly.
Right.